Hello, my name is Dr. Barry Laga, and I'm a professor of English at Colorado Mesa University. And I am delighted to be here and honored to be here to talk about Holocaust Awareness Week. And my specialty, among other things, is looking at Holocaust memorials and monuments. And so I want you to imagine that you're a student in a classroom, and I wish that we could interact better, but I will ask an enormous amount of you in terms of reading things and pondering some of the things that I'm going to show you. And so first I want to talk about memorials and monuments. And so you think, well, what is the difference between those? Right? How do we differentiate between them? And so if you take a look at this quote by Danto, that you'll notice as you read this that one points to the past and one points to the future. One focuses more on memory, and the other one focuses more on where do we go from here. And so today we're going to talk about both of these. And so as we think about monuments and memorials, we have all kinds of questions about the purpose. Right? Why do we have monuments and why do we have memorials? And as we look here at this list, we have a wide variety of options. Right? Is it to console viewers? Is it to help our memory? Is it to educate? Is it to feel better about ourselves? These monuments and memorials do all of these things, right? They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but some do them better than others. And so another complication would be, should there be an aesthetic appeal to the Holocaust memorials? Should they be pretty? Should we portray something so horrendous and so appalling in ways that we enjoy them, that we give them a rating in Yelp? Is it really possible to say, oh, I enjoyed going to Auschwitz? Another complication, that often when we build a memorial, it's in order to forget it. That if we can just build something, then I can stop thinking about it. So there are lots of people who say we need to stop building these monuments, but we need to continue to think about them, right? That we shouldn't forget them, and a monument or a memorial gives us permission to stop thinking about it. Or another complication is that we try to understand it, and that is perfectly normal, right? It makes sense that we want to understand something so horrific. But on the other hand, the moment that we try to explain something, we simplify it and we tame it. And so that's a danger with the Holocaust and how complex it is. Yet another complication is that, how do we try to understand something when it surpasses our powers of understanding? That it just goes well beyond it. And so some people, for example, if you look at this beautiful passage by Jean Amery, he is a Holocaust survivor. And as he explains in this citation, that he talks about the difficulty of comparing one thing with another. And we can say, well, it's like a red hot iron in my shoulders, or it is like a dull wooden stake that has been driven into the back of my head. But what happens when we do this is we are just replacing one experience with another. That it's a substitution game that can never fully help us understand. So we can never adequately and fully understand the Holocaust, even as we desperately try to do that. Another complication is that we ask this fundamental question of, is truth based on the mind or the heart, on reasoning or on feeling? And the answer to that question shapes the kind of monument or memorial that we build. The other problem is that even though we feel a need to monumentalize or memorialize trauma, by doing so we can often re-traumatize the victim by reminding them of horrific acts, right? Rubbing their noses in this painful history one more time. So the question is that healthy? Is that something that we should do? But yet we have to balance that with the problem of forgetting, because that is equally problematic. We have yet a couple more complications, right? So a scholar argues that we are too obsessed with the past. The next step is to move on to the future, right? That we shouldn't let the past be an albatross around our neck that is weighing us down, and that we need to keep going, because we can't progress if we look at the past. At least that's one view, a controversial view. Another one says, well, no monument can be adequate to the task. So as a result, this person argues that the only pilgrimage, dear reader, would be to look sadly at the stormy sky now and then, because it's impossible to adequately represent the Holocaust. And so a key question, right, among all of these complications would be, it is less a question of should we remember the Holocaust. We absolutely should, right? That is not in dispute. But the question is, how should we remember it? What's the method? What's the technique? What's the strategy? What's the architecture in order to do it? So the rest of the presentation will go through different modes and different methods of representation. And we'll talk about the gains and limitations of those. So first one is what we'll call the romantic ideal. And it presents a heroic, self-aggrandizing figurative icons that celebrate national ideals and triumphs or sentimental odes to the fallen. And to give you an example, I'll show you some monuments and memorials that are not related to the Holocaust but illustrate what I'm talking about. So one would be some monuments in America to the Civil War or to the Revolutionary War. And so you have the sentimental mother or wife in the middle, right? Demonstrating how sad she is. Or you have the heroic portrayal of men. In another case, we have the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, right? Or a monument to, I believe this is the Vietnam War. It's not the Vietnam Memorial, but it's a memorial to the men who fought. So again, it focuses on the heroic side. On the sentimental side, this is a sculpture by Käthe Kollwitz, a German woman. But again, we have the mother who is lamenting the death of her child. And it's an emotional appeal. So then when we look at Holocaust monuments that work within this aesthetic, we have this example of the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so as you look at the artwork, you can see that it is foregrounding heroic figures, right? They're larger than life. They are, they're in heroic poses. So that's one example. Another one would be this memorial in New York City, where the soldier who is liberated, one of the victims of the Holocaust, is shown carrying him. Again, it's a sentimental portrayal. Or you have, this is preparatory to talk about the Holocaust Museum in DC. And as Fried explains, I don't believe that you could ever understand the Holocaust with the mind. You have to feel it. Feeling may be a better way of getting at it, because the horror is not an intellectual category as far as I can tell. So we move from the mind to the heart, from rationality to feelings. And so other ways to think about this is to say, well, what is the real, right? What is reality is in the heart, or what the mind experiences. It's not what we see with our eyes necessarily, right? It's more internal. Or following Freud, it's a preoccupation with the psyche, the unconscious, the subconscious, our dreams. Or as someone explained, the point of art is to externalize the fermentation of inner life, or give objective expression to inner experience in both form and content. So we go again from the outside to the inside. And just ways to illustrate that, we can look at some comments made by famous expressionist artists. But again, they have nothing to do with the Holocaust per se. But as you look at these passages, you can see where they talk about the need to move beyond objective expression. For example, Brancusi argues that it is impossible for anyone to express anything essentially real by imitating its exterior surface. Or Sol LeWitt, conceptual artists are mystics rather than rationalists. The leap to conclusions logic cannot reach. So again, we move from the mind to the heart, mind to the psyche. And so some artwork that we're familiar with that exemplifies this aesthetic would be some famous expressionists. So we had Edvard Munch's The Scream and Kirchner's artwork. Again, they're not interested in portraying external reality. They are interested in expressing reality by looking from within. Or we can look at more Kirchner artworks, or by Paul Klee. Again, the point to remember, these are not bad artists. It is not a point of, that they don't know how to draw a figure. What they're trying to say is that they are, to go back to the quote we read a minute ago, externalize the fermentation of inner life. So they're still expressing reality, but it's a truer reality because it's inside. Or we have an Ensor painting, same concept, where, again, it's not that he's a bad artist, but he's trying to portray externally the internal qualities of his citizens that surround him. So then we take the same concept and then we look at some Holocaust memorials and monuments. So here we are in Mauthausen, Austria, and so we have a stylized menorah and then stylized characters in Hebrew, which means to remember. And so, but even the form itself of the menorah, right? It's a little bit jagged, it's a bit distorted. It's trying to convey more than a menorah. It's trying to convey inner feelings. Or even more explicitly, where we are in Treblinka, Poland, and so you have all these shards that represent victims of the Holocaust. So they are symbolic in that they're abstract, they're jagged, they're fragmented and fractured. They're not trying to convey objective reality, they're trying to convey something deeper, even intangible and perhaps inexpressible. Or in Płocko, Poland. And so you have, again, stylized figures, right? So they don't do away with representation completely, but then we also have that jagged scar going through the middle, which invokes, among other things, the Jewish practice of tearing one's garment at a moment of grief. And then we have in Dachau, so two versions. One is it's artwork. Obviously it looks like barbed wire, but if you look closely, it invokes skeletons. And then the memorial on the left side, where it invokes an oven, crematoria, even as you go down into it, into the darkness. And so it's not trying to duplicate, right, a oven that exterminated and disseminated so many. Its task is to invoke a feeling. And as you go down, as you walk down the ramp, you're walking into a pit, into the darkness, and that's a way to invoke those internal feelings. We also have in Madiank, Poland, and you can see how massive this is. There's people right underneath, and trying to convey just the heavy weight of history that is weighing down upon any visitor who is there. Or we can go to Boston. They have 6 towers, these glass towers. They are designed to represent some of the 6 worst camps that exterminated victims of the Holocaust. And then there are, they're etched into the glass, are, I try to get a closer view, are names of people, and then there's just this slight hint of smoke that comes up through these towers that invokes or evokes the ovens and the chimneys where they were exterminated or disposed of. And so, and then we make and then this is another useful way to think about representation. So Jane Kaplan explains that the D-realist attempts to mythify the Holocaust by making it a trans-historical event whose real meaning may perhaps only be appropriate in its fullest sense by those who are said to have participated in it. And then that is balanced with the hyper-realist seeks to resist this dehistoricization by fixing explanations of the genocide in textual sources and readings that are as precise and incontrovertible as possible. And so you have this tension between those who say you can't understand the Holocaust and everything went with it, and then you have the other side of the spectrum that tries to document in painstaking detail, every detail, every document, every photograph, everyone. And so there's always this tension between those two ideas, that we can understand it and that we can't. And so this also shapes what we see. So these are some architectural drawings of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And we will come back to this later, but you have the main part of the museum, and then you have the hexagon, which is the Hall of Remembrance that we'll talk about in a minute. And so as they were designing this building, the architects talked about the fact that the building is a resonator of your own imagery, of your own memory, that it's not symbolic, it is suggestive. So everything they would do, they don't pretend that they can accurately depict the Holocaust, but they want to invoke it, they want to suggest it, and that allows us as visitors to then fill in the gaps. And so this is just the outside. We'll go on to the inside in a minute. So even as you look at the outside, you can see that it's suggestive of crematoria, right? Especially the photograph in the middle, that if you have seen a crematoria at one of these death camps, you can see that it has the same kinds of lines and texture and even materials. It's very industrial, which also is suggestive of some of the concentration camps. And then on the one hand, on the document side, the realist side, they go to great lengths to document what happened to the victims. And so you have artifact after artifact after photograph that shows that, yes, in fact, the Holocaust happened. Right? It's an argument against those who were so vile enough to deny the Holocaust. And then, at the same time, right, there's that side that we don't understand. And as Fried explains, we wanted an invocation or an evocation of the incomplete. Things call for interpretation but remain insufficient in themselves. And so we have artwork, this very abstract, non-representational artwork throughout the museum. So you have these panels by Ellsworth Kelly. Again, they don't represent anything. They're not symbolic of anything. They're just merely suggestive. In many ways, trying to convey convey our inability to understand what happened. Or you'll have similar kinds of artwork, non-representational, abstract, or this work by Richard Serra, just a massive piece of steel. Then on the outside, right, so on the left side of the museum those are where the exhibits are, and you could say that's the realist part. And then in the hexagon, we have the Hall of Remembrance, and it's completely empty, completely non-representational. And it's a place for visitors to go there, sit and contemplate and process what they've seen, what they've heard. So the museum tries to offer, or appeal to different ways of knowing and different ways of being. So another kind of genre that happens, we've talked about expressionist monuments and memorials, and we've talked about romantic monuments and memorials, and now we're going to talk about counter monuments, which I find personally to be some of the most innovative and interesting and provocative. And so as James Young explains, brazen, painfully self-conscious memorial spaces conceived to challenge the very premises of their being. Counter-monuments are ethically certain of their duty to remember, but aesthetically skeptical of the assumptions underpinning traditional memorial forms. So one early counter-monument was the monument against fascism. And so Young explains that a monument against fascism would have to be a monument against itself, against the traditional didactic function of monuments, against their tendency to displace the past they demand we contemplate, and finally, against the authoritarian propensity in monumental spaces that reduces viewers to passive spectators. So another way to phrase it is, they want us to question the purpose of a memorial and monument, and they want us to be active. And so what they built is a monument that is truly active. So in an ugly part of Hamburg, they built this tower, and it had soft metal in it. And so people were allowed to scribble anything they wanted. And then over time, it was gradually submerged. And so they would interact with it. It's a performative work. Again, they could say terrible things. They could be fascist things. They could be sensitive and tender things. And then it would slowly, slowly move. So over time, the tower sunk into the ground until at the very end, we started with it on the left, and then it sunk, and then you get to the right, and then it's no more. It has served its purpose, and then there's a plaque commemorating that. So it was the process of remembering, the process of interacting with the monument is what counts. Or we have this monument. I mean, this one is unrealized. It was merely an idea, right? To blow up the Brandenburg Gate, grind its stone into dust, sprinkle the remains over its former site, then cover the entire area with granite plates. How better to remember a destroyed people than by a destroyed monument? And the reason why he chose the Brandenburg Gate is because it's a monument to military victory. So what better way to create a counter monument than to destroy this monument to militarism? And so another one is, again, still working with the Brandenburg Gate. Right, this is in downtown Berlin. So someone had projected this image with Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes one free. It's the same text that often greeted victims as they entered concentration camps. And so by superimposing that slogan onto the Brandenburg Gate, that one, people are seeing it all the time. So it's interactive in that sense. But then it also makes a connection between German military might and the Holocaust, as well as from the past to the present. Or we have Aschrotbrunnen, which means the fountain of a man named Aschrot. And so it was known as the Jewish fountain. And so during the 30s, it was destroyed. And so just obliterated, right? And so no more. So what happened, though, is that the architects thought through this. And what they did is they recreated the fountain, but they inverted it. And so they took the long spire, recreated that, turned it upside down, and then submerged it. And then the water would flow into it. And so part of the symbolism of this is reminding us of the demise of the fountain and everything that that implies, but it also creates a contemplative space. You go to the fountain, you look down, you look at the water, you think of absence rather than presence. And that's also a key concept with counter monuments, that so many monuments memorials focus on presence. Again, the heroic figure. Counter monuments often encourage us to think about what's not there. And this is a really good example of that. Another one has to do with these names and blocks from Jews from Kassel. And so what they did is they had school children do homework and biographies of Jews who were killed in the Holocaust from Kassel, or Kassel, however you want to pronounce it. And so then they wrapped these stories around stone blocks, pavés, cobblestones that just paved the streets. And then what they would do is they would stack them up on railroad stations to remind people that it was from those very railroad stations that Jews were deported off to concentration camps. And the fact that these school children actively did the memory work. They worked hard to learn about them. So they're not passive or viewers, right? They are actively creating the monument. So as we go to the Bayerischer Platz, and so here, this is very, very clever. So one thing that's interesting when we talk about the Holocaust is we often think that it was done by thugs who were breaking the law. And what this memorial demonstrates is that much of what the German leaders did was absolutely legal because they passed laws. So what the monument does is they post on various signs throughout the town different laws that were passed during that time period. So there's an example on this one is talking about that Jews are not allowed to be outside after 8 o'clock. Or another one would be, Jewish children can't play in this playground. Or Jews are now not allowed to own pets. And on and on. And so the idea would be that people are walking around their neighborhood. They are seeing these laws. And what was interesting about this is that they put these up overnight. And so a lot of people were scandalized by the fact that these seemingly racist signs were littering their neighborhood. But it's really an exhibit that reminding people that much of what the Nazis did was legal because legislators passed laws to do it. And this exhibit reminds them of that. And it's also, what's important to know is that it's where they live. You go to the playground and you see one of these signs. You go to the subway and you see one of these signs. So that way, because too often we think that the nasty things that happened in the Holocaust and with fascism happened in dirty, hidden places. And this counter monument shows that, in a sense, it happened in broad daylight, and people were complicit. And Babelplatz in Berlin, this is right in front of Humboldt University. And this was the notorious location where in 1933 the Nazis had one of their many book burnings. And so those are the historical photographs. And then today, what it is it's a hole in the ground, right? And there's plexiglass on the top, and you get closer, and then you notice that there's empty bookcases, right? And reminding people of all the books that were burned in this spot back at that time. And Missing House. So what they've done here, and again, this goes back to the aesthetic of foregrounding absence, is that they would find out where people lived, and then in these missing places, they would then identify the Jews and other victims of the Holocaust who perished. And so we'd have names and signifying dates, so that way, they're foregrounded and we are reminded who they are, but we're also reminded that they are absent. In Buchenwald, one of the more notorious concentration camps, that originally they had this kind of pyramid monument, right? It was just kind of conventional, nondescript. And then it was replaced with this plate. And what's interesting about this plate is that it's heated and eternally at 98.6 degrees, right? Our temperature. And so what happens almost inevitably is people reach down to touch it. And so, I've been there and I've done the same thing. And so you're touching this plate and you are connecting yourself in a sense, in a very abstract way, to another human being. You are also kneeling, which is this gesture of reverence and contemplation. And you put your hand out and you touch that warm plate and you think about the lives lost. Then we have Stolpersteine. And so that literally means stumbling stone. And so, first of all, we have this interesting passage, right? Günter Demig cites the Talmud, saying that a person is only forgotten when his or her name is forgotten. The Stolpersteine in front of the buildings bring back to memory the people who once lived there. Each stone begins with "here lived." One stone, one name, one person. And so, multiple allusions. So on the one hand, it invokes the anti-Semitic saying when accidentally stumbling over a protruding stone, one said, "A Jew must be buried here." In a metaphorical sense, the German term Stolperstein can mean potential problem. The term to stumble across something in German and English can also mean to find out something by chance. And it's also an issue that we have not resolved. So all of those allusions are invoked. All those references are contained in this monument. And so what they are, they're very simple. They're about, 3 inches by 3 inches. They are cemented into the ground. And they say, "Here lived Ida Arensberg." Tells when she was born, when she was deported, and when she died, and where she died. And as you wander through Europe, you come across these everywhere in surprising places. You go to the store and you look down and there might be a couple of these. You go to someone's personal residence and then you come across one of these. And so this idea is that it's this constant reminder. It's not flashy. It's not excessive. Right? It's not monumental in the sense of having a huge statue. It's this simple reminder underneath your feet that in a sense you stumble over and you stop and say, wow, here lived Ida Arensberg. And because of the Holocaust, right, she was deported and died. And so, again, they can be as simple as, one or in twos. This, I believe, was a school. And so you have lots of them. One of the largest, most ambitious projects is the Monument to the Murdered Jews in Europe in Berlin. Took years, super controversial. And before they started, they had a contest, right? And the architects would submit what they needed to, their proposals. Because the original monument was really this old neoclassical structure, and they put this Kati Kolowitz sculpture inside, and they said, okay, there's your Holocaust memorial. And people obviously said, this is inadequate. We can do better than this. So then they had a series of again, this contest. And so I'll talk about a few that didn't make it, obviously. So this one, what they wanted to do is to build the ring road that goes around Berlin in cobblestones, which would, as you're flying at 140 kilometers per hour in your car, you hit these cobblestones and then you immediately slow down. And if you've ever driven on cobblestones, you know what a racket that creates. So you have to drive slowly. It forces you to contemplate. And so it's a kind of forced memory as you go on this freeway. But that was rejected. Another one was that they wanted to create a bus terminal, right? And it would say memory on the side of it, Denkmal. And the idea would be that you get in the bus and you would drive to different Holocaust sites. And part of it wasn't just to drive to these sites, but by being in this bus, going to and fro those monuments, it would give you a time to contemplate and to process and to think about what you've seen and experienced. So this is the site that's chosen. It's right next door to the Brandenburg Gate. And again, these are some other losing proposals. The one that was accepted, at least initially, it looked like this. And then, I'll show you the real version in a minute. But there's 2,711 concrete slabs on top, and then there's an exhibition hall, kind of a museum down below. And as the architect explains, right, Eisenman said, I think the experience of walking through the memorial might be something close to what it's really like to be alone in some place. It's a field of pillars that attempts to decontextualize the Holocaust. Not to try and locate it, not to try to make it a thing of nostalgia, not to try and make it to be able to be rationalized. I don't want people to weep and then walk away with a clear conscience. So those were all his aspirations. We'll skip this one for a second. So he had worked with a famous philosopher and literary critic, Jacques Derrida. He was interested in this concept of a chora, which is a female receptacle. Right? He explains it, or Derrida explains, a chora is a spacing that is the necessary condition for everything that takes place. It cannot be represented. And so we'll go to, this is what it looks like now. So over 2,500 stone blocks. It's spread over a multi-acre area. You are free to walk anywhere around it, in it, through it. They're ginormous. As you walk through, it's true that the comparison that Eisenman makes is like a cornfield. And so you are walking through, it's a bit disorienting. The landscape undulates underneath you. It's never flat. You kind of get lost. And what's kind of interesting is that, let me show you. Well, I'll come back to that. This is the exhibition hall underneath. It's very minimalist. Also, you can see that even while you're underneath, you know where the blocks are above your head. Just to show you that, and this goes back to the balance between being too abstract and being too rational and realist. And so initially, Eisenman did not want this as part of the monument, but others just insisted on having it. And then inevitably, people use it in any way that they want. I've been there multiple times, and they do have, a security person who shoos people away if they're playing too many games. But at the same time, people do anyway, which feels like it's a desecration of a holy site to see kids play hide and go seek, jump from top to bottom. Right? They use it like a play park, which is appalling in a way. You could go to the internet right now and type this in, and you will see all kinds of selfies with people. And that raises the issue of ethics Again, should a Holocaust memorial or monument be pleasing to the eye? Should it be a fun place? Is it a place where one goes and puts out one's lunch? But Eisenman doesn't police that. He's interested in giving people the opportunity to have a good experience, but he's not going to force it on anyone. Just other examples of people, again, having lunch, having a good time. Also in Berlin, there's a new Jewish museum. It's about 20 years old by now. It used to be, again, in an old neoclassical building. Again, found it to be inadequate. So again, invoking this literary philosopher, explaining that it's a critique of everything that subordinated architecture to something else, use, beauty, or living. We have to refuse the hegemony of functionality, of the aesthetic, and of dwelling. It is a move to free architecture from all those external finalities, those extraneous goals. And so we get, as a result, let me back up. So Libeskind, the architect himself, said, if architecture does not want to enter the next millennium as the last fortress of totality, it must confess its allegiance to what is a consensus in social and political dimensions, pluralism and the renaissance of a decentralized systems, a conscious use of resources, and especially its own history. And so what he comes, we'll skip that for a minute. Part of his aspirations are connecting dots on a map between a network of Jews and non-Jews created in an urban and cultural constellation of world history. He's interested in fragmentation, and he's interested in this notion of urban apocalypse. And so you think, well, what kind of museum is created based on those premises? And this is what he came up with. And as you can see, the old building is to the right. And then the museum that Libeskind created. And Libeskind, by the way, might be a familiar term because he created the new One Tower in New York after 9/11. After much negotiation and wrangling, Libeskind's original idea was different. But so there's an American connection to Libeskind. But I digress. So if we go back, we can see the jaggedness of this museum. And again, it goes back to that idea of trying to express the chaos, the fractured nature of the Holocaust. Outside, even the walls are kind of scarred in a sense. It's both a beautiful building and a crazy, weird building, all at the same time. Again, more of these jagged scars, or some people describe them as wounds on the museum. Again, fractured. And then we enter through the neoclassical building. And then the museum is formed on different axes of exile, Holocaust, and continuity. And they take you in different ways. And so the museum, even though it's a museum and its goal is to teach us about the Holocaust and teach us about Jewish history, the building itself is an art object. And it goes back to the idea of trying to evoke and suggest some of the feelings or some of the imagery or illusions of fascism or the Holocaust and victims and perpetrators. This one is the Axis of Exile, or refers to those who were able to escape. And there are these Russian olive trees. There is called the Axis of Holocaust, and it's this tower, which has the only light in it is a small little window near the top. It's very echoey. It's very disturbing to be inside this room. It's just, you feel alienated, you feel isolated and lonely. And then you make your way through this fractured staircase. And then you arrive at this this particular artwork. And there are these strange things called voids, these empty spaces in the museum by design. And then, and as Libeskind explains, they symbolize the emptiness that is created when an entire community is eliminated or when individual freedom is suppressed. And this goes back to that fundamental desire of those counter monuments, is to create or draw attention to absence rather than presence. So this particular artwork I found so moving and interesting. And so it's this huge landscape of metal faces. And you're supposed to walk on them. And as you walk on them, one, it feels like you are being profane, that it's blasphemous to walk on faces. And they make this weird, eerie, clinking sound. But the part of the problem, and by design, is in order to give a voice to the voiceless, you have to walk on these pieces. So you walk along, right, as these actually it's my son and wife who are walking, and there's this eerie sound, and the pieces move underneath your feet. It's unstable. It's just a really interesting piece of artwork. And then there's some main galleries that are more traditional that you'd say, oh, I've been to museums like this. Then we have what's called, another place in the museum called the Topography of Terror. And what's interesting about this one is it's located on the previous site of the SS police office, and the Reich SS leadership, among other things. All the buildings were destroyed and later leveled. And the Berlin Wall was part of the site for a while. So these are what the historic photographs of what it used to be, right, where the Gestapo had their headquarters, among other places. This is what it looked like with the Berlin Wall running through it. And so it first started as an open-air exhibit. And so the purpose, right, is to relay historical information about the Nazi regime and its crimes, and to encourage people to actively confront its history, including its aftermath since 1945. So they are absolutely committed to documenting in a very traditional way the victims, the perpetrators, the history that is associated with this. And then aesthetically, it's interesting. They describe it as an open wound. The terrain, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, but the terrain is perceived as a disruption to the familiar, an open wound in the city and in its German history as well. With its traces of wartime and post-war history, the impact of the terrain as a whole is jarring. For that reason, the Commission expressly opposes any kind of artistic treatment of the terrain. And so what you get, well, one more, hang on. We should avoid grand urban planning gestures, obvious symbolism, and any pretentious museum character. The building structure should neither reshape nor dominate the site. And then this is what it would look like. So you can see that it is really, truly ugly, right? It's this open wound. You have all these gray rocks, right? There's nothing pretty about it. And then you have the building, and inside it is very simple, but it's really a documentation center that, again, personally I've spent, it was a good week every day, all day, reading, and looking at photographs and whatnot. That there's nothing aesthetically pleasing about it. And that is all by design, because they want the focus not to be on, the grassy field. They don't want any aesthetic dimension. They want the focus to be on hardcore history to document what happened. Just other pictures as we get closer to the building. And these are the exhibits. Again, nothing fancy. Explain the side of the perpetrators. The wall underlines unmistakably the historical association between the Nazi regime of terror in Europe and the Cold War and the German division. And what that means is that there is still remnants of the Berlin Wall that run right through the site. So they are connected, visually, just and by geography. That you have to cross, by the Berlin Wall as you access the topography of terror. So there's this big question then, right? The question is not how are people moved by these memorials, but rather to what end have they been moved? To what historical conclusions? To what understanding and actions in their own lives? These are the really big questions. Because if we are moved emotionally by these photographs, by these sites, by the artwork, by the things we experience, the question is, okay, you're moved, but moved to do what? What are you going to do? What's the next step? So what if you know these facts and figures, right? It goes back to what end have they been moved? Then someone else, a scholar of the Holocaust, argued, and bear with me with this long quote because I think it's worthwhile. The best German memorial to the fascist era and its victims may not be to a single memorial at all, but simply the never-to-be-resolved debate over which kind of memory to preserve, how to do it, in whose name, and in what end. That is, what are the consequences of such memory? How do Germans respond to current persecutions of foreigners in their midst in light of their memory of the Third Reich and its crimes? Instead of a fixed sculptural or architectural icon for Holocaust memory in Germany, the debate itself, perpetually unresolved amid ever-changing conditions, might now be enshrined. So in other words, sometimes memorials and monuments allow or give people permission to stop thinking about it. They can check off the box and say, we built the monument, my conscience is clear. But James Young is suggesting that that's inadequate, that often, or perhaps always, the debate about the monuments is what matters. And I think this is super relevant for us today as Americans as we talk about our racist past and we talk about Confederate monuments. What do we do with those? And so it would be inadequate to leave them up. It would be inadequate to merely tear them down and replace them with something else. That there has to be a better approach and say, well, how do we simultaneously draw attention to our shameful past as well as engage those who are there? How can we, again, going back to his question or his idea, the debate itself, perpetually unresolved amid ever-changing conditions, might now be enshrined. And so that's something for us to think about with our own shameful past. One last story, and then I'll be done. So in one of my many visits to Germany and to Berlin, I went to a place called Saxonhausen, which is in a suburb of Berlin now. And it was not as notorious of a camp as other places. But certainly there were thousands and thousands who died there. And what I found is a very moving story is that there were a group of inmates, victims, who were assigned to work with people who have died. And their job was to catalog them. And the victims were stacked up like cordwood. And so it was just a painful process. And the people who worked there were musicians. And what's interesting is that they smuggled in sheet music and violins. And they would practice, right? It's dangerous, but they would practice and rehearse music while they were in this area that they were supposed to create these pseudo-autopsies and create these fake letters to relatives. And then, so that's astonishing enough, right? Here in the life and death situation, that they would smuggle in musical instruments. And then they would play, they had this concert, again, almost under the threat of death, that they played a concert for their fellow inmates. And this one person who had heard it, he goes, I fed on that experience for months. Right? I fed on that experience for months. And I find that what a testimony to the value of even arts and humanities. That when people are in the most dire circumstances, where it's a difference between life and death, where a piece of bread can keep you going for one more day, this person explained that listening to music played by a fellow inmate in the most dire circumstances ever, that helped him keep going. And I find that story beyond inspiring, that it's so moving about the human spirit to help each other, to care for each other, even in the face of genocide and annihilation. So I thank you for being here, and I am delighted that you are attending in an altered venue, the Holocaust Awareness Week. And I would be delighted if you sent me an email and shared any of your observations. So thank you very much.